Hello guys, welcome to Infinite Stories. Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Let's get into the story. The Harrington estate was an imposing structure, marble floors, towering columns, and manicured gardens stretching beyond sight. Yet, behind the opulence, loneliness loomed. Charles Harrington, a 38-year-old widower, lived in the mansion with his 5-year-old son, Henry. Since his wife's tragic death 3 years ago, the home's warmth had faded, replaced by cold routines and hollow laughter. Charles was a devoted father, but his demanding business often pulled him away, leaving Henry in need of care and companionship. The boy grew quieter each day, and it pained Charles to see his vibrant son fading into solitude. In desperation, Charles decided to hire a new nanny, hoping that someone could restore the spark in Henry's eyes and ease his own guilt for being absent so often. When Annabel Reeves arrived at the estate gates, she paused to admire the sprawling property before her. At 28 years old, Annabel carried a quiet strength, her brown eyes reflecting both kindness and determination. Having spent years caring for children in difficult circumstances, she knew how to connect with young hearts. As she approached the front door, her modest dress fluttered in the breeze, and she took a steadying breath. This was more than just a job, it felt like a fresh start. The butler greeted her formally and led her into the grand foyer. From the shadows of the staircase, Henry peeked out, his eyes wide with curiosity. Annabel smiled warmly at him, and something in her expression made the boy step out a little farther. In that moment, a connection sparked, tentative but real. The first few days in the Harrington household were careful dances of distance and cautious observation. Annabel kept her movements gentle and her tone soft, knowing that trust was earned slowly, especially with a child like Henry. He clutched his toy elephant whenever she was near, a protective barrier between them. Annabel didn't push him. Instead, she shared stories about her own childhood adventures, her voice filled with wonder and imagination. At first, Henry listened in silence, his eyes studying her face for signs of insincerity. But one afternoon, as she told a story about a brave little boy who sailed across an enchanted sea, he whispered, "Did he find treasure?" Annabel's heart swelled. It was a small question, but it was a doorway to trust. "Yes," she replied softly, "but the greatest treasure was the friends he made along the way." Charles observed these subtle changes from a distance. He often worked late into the night, but during brief breaks, he watched Annabel and Henry from his study window. He marveled at her patience, how she never rushed Henry or demanded his affection. There was something calming about her presence, a warmth that seemed to soften the edges of the mansion's cold grandeur. For the first time in months, he heard Henry laugh, a bright, uninhibited sound that made his chest tighten. Annabel was accomplishing in days what Charles had failed to do in years. It stirred something inside him, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and a strange, fluttering awareness that he quickly dismissed as fatigue. After all, she was the nanny, hired to heal his son, not to stir his own weary heart. As the days turned into weeks, Annabel settled into her role. Henry gradually opened up, asking questions, giggling at her stories, and showing her his favorite toys. The mansion, once filled with silence, now echoed with the sounds of life. One evening, after putting Henry to bed, Annabel found herself wandering into the library. She was drawn to the rows of books and the scent of leather and parchment. Charles was there, a forgotten glass of brandy by his side, his eyes scanning a ledger. He looked up, surprised. "I didn't expect anyone else to be awake," he said, his voice softer than usual. Annabel hesitated, feeling like she had intruded, but Charles gestured to a chair. "Please, stay." They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling fireplace filling the room with warmth. Then, Charles asked, "How do you do it? How do you understand Henry so well?" Annabel smiled gently. "Children need patience and someone who truly listens. Henry just needed to know someone cared." Her words struck a chord in Charles. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes clouded with regret. "I wish I could be that person for him," he confessed. Annabel's gaze softened. "You already are. He talks about you all the time. He just misses you." The honesty in her words stirred something deep within Charles, a reminder that perhaps it wasn't too late to bridge the gap between him and his son. The rain battered the windows relentlessly, casting shadows over the house. Henry sat by the window, his nose pressed against the glass. "We can't go outside," he sighed, disappointment etched on his small face. Annabel knelt beside him. "Who says adventures only happen outside?" she said with a mischievous grin. Henry's eyes widened as she pulled out blankets, pillows, and fairy lights from a closet. In no time, they built a sprawling fort in the living room. Annabel crawled inside, inviting Henry with a playful laugh. They made shadow puppets on the walls, told stories by flashlight, and giggled until their sides ached. For the first time, Henry forgot about the gloomy rain. Charles returned home early that day, his coat dripping from the storm. He paused in the doorway, taking in the sight before him. The fortress of blankets and the sound of Henry's carefree laughter brought a smile to his lips. He quietly set his briefcase down, unwilling to break the spell. Annabel turned, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. "Join us," she offered. He hesitated, but then Henry peeked out, his face alight with joy. "Please, Daddy." Something inside Charles melted. He removed his wet coat and stepped into their makeshift world, feeling, for the first time in years, like he belonged. The days grew brighter, even when the clouds loomed overhead. Charles spent more time with Henry and Annabel, shedding his aloofness bit by bit. Henry's laughter became a balm to his weary soul, and Annabel's gentle presence brought unexpected comfort. They shared quiet dinners together, the clinking of silverware accompanied by light-hearted conversation. Annabel's stories filled the silences, and Charles found himself drawn to her voice, her smile, and the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of things she loved. He caught himself watching her too long, his thoughts drifting into dangerous territory. She was the nanny, he reminded himself, but the line between professional and personal was beginning to blur. Annabel noticed the change, too. Charles's gaze lingered, his conversations grew more personal, and the distance he once kept seemed to evaporate. She tried to ignore the fluttering in her chest, the warmth that spread whenever he laughed or looked at her with those deep, contemplative eyes. But denying it became harder with each passing day. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden with Henry between them, their hands accidentally brushed. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through both of them. They glanced at each other, startled, the air thick with unspoken feelings. Henry, oblivious to the tension, tugged their hands and shouted, "Race you to the fountain." And just like that, the moment was gone, leaving behind a mix of longing and confusion. Charles buried himself in work, trying to stifle the growing feelings that threatened his carefully controlled world. He spent late nights in his study, surrounded by ledgers and contracts, but his thoughts wandered to Annabel. Her laughter echoed in his mind, and the memory of her eyes haunted him. It felt dangerous, this warmth that bloomed whenever he thought of her. He reminded himself of his responsibilities. Henry, the estate, the reputation of the Harrington name. Falling for the nanny was out of the question. But logic did little to quell the emotions stirring inside him. Every smile she gave Henry, every gentle touch, made it harder to resist the pull toward her. Annabel felt the distance growing between them. Charles became more formal, his conversations clipped and professional. She convinced herself it was better this way, that whatever spark had ignited between them needed to be extinguished. Yet, despite her resolve, her heart ached. The bond they'd shared was now strained, and the warmth that had started to fill the mansion was beginning to fade. One evening, as she sat by the fire reading to Henry, she looked up to find Charles watching from the doorway. Their eyes met, and for a moment, his mask slipped. The vulnerability she saw there mirrored her own, but just as quickly, he turned away. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Annabel feeling more alone than ever. Annabel couldn't sleep. The ache in her chest was relentless, a reminder of the widening gap between her and Charles. She replayed their shared moments, the laughter, the silent glances, and that fleeting touch in the garden. Were they merely figments of her imagination, or had he felt it too? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She spent the next morning tending to Henry with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Henry noticed the change. "Why are you sad, Annabel?" he asked, his small fingers brushing her cheek. She gathered him into her arms, blinking back tears. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Just thinking." But Henry wasn't fooled. His eyes, wise beyond his years, studied her quietly. He didn't push her for answers, but his gentle concern tugged at her heart. Later that day, as Annabel organized Henry's books in the library, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Charles, his expression unreadable. "Annabel," he began, his voice low, "I need to talk to you." Her heart pounded as she nodded, her fingers trembling. He hesitated, his eyes conflicted. "I've been distant. I thought it was the right thing to do. But it's only making things worse." Annabel's breath caught. She met his gaze, vulnerability shimmering in her eyes. "You don't have to protect me from your feelings, Charles." The honesty of her words hit him hard. For a moment, they stood in silence, emotions tangled and raw. But before either could say more, Henry burst in with a drawing, breaking the spell and leaving their words unspoken. Charles knew he couldn't keep running from his feelings. That conversation in the library had cracked something inside him. He spent the evening in his study, the shadows of his past and the promise of his future warring within him. He thought of his late wife, the love they had shared, and the emptiness that followed her loss. Guilt bubbled up. Was it disloyal to care for someone else? But Annabel's face kept intruding on his thoughts, her kindness, her patience, and the way she brought Henry back to life. The truth was undeniable. He was falling in love. This realization both terrified and exhilarated him. Could he risk his heart again? Could he trust that he deserved this happiness? The following morning, Charles found Annabel in the garden, her hair catching the morning sunlight. He hesitated, then stepped forward. "Annabel," he said softly. She turned, her eyes widening at the raw emotion in his voice. "I've been a coward," he confessed. "I was afraid to let you in. But you've changed everything. You've given Henry his smile back, and you've given me hope." Her breath hitched. The vulnerability in his eyes stripped away her defenses. "I care about you, Charles," she admitted. "But this isn't just about us. There's Henry." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "We'll take it slowly. But I don't want to hide from this anymore." For the first time in weeks, they smiled, a fragile yet hopeful promise hanging between them. Despite their tentative understanding, doubts lingered. Annabel couldn't shake the fear that this fragile connection would shatter. She spent her days with Henry, cherishing his laughter and bright curiosity, but her nights were restless. What if she was wrong to let herself hope? The Harrington world was one of wealth, expectations, and scrutiny. Would there be a place for her in it, or was she setting herself up for heartbreak? She poured her worries into late-night journaling, the scratch of her pen a small comfort. One evening, as she closed her notebook, she found Charles standing at the doorway, watching her with concern. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She nodded, her eyes shadowed with doubt. He stepped inside and sat beside her. "I know this is complicated," he said. "But I don't want you to feel alone in this." His hand brushed hers, and she closed her eyes, drawing strength from his touch. "I'm afraid, Charles," she whispered. "Afraid of what people will say, afraid of getting hurt." He squeezed her hand. "I'm afraid too. But sometimes, the things we fear the most are the ones worth fighting for." His words wrapped around her like a protective shield, and for a moment, the fear ebbed. They sat together in the quiet, the weight of their emotions shared between them. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was enough. Their newfound honesty brought a fragile peace to the household, but it wasn't long before reality intruded. One afternoon, while Charles was away on business, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mrs. Helena Winthrop, an old family friend known for her sharp tongue and sharper opinions, swept into the drawing room, her eyes narrowing the moment they landed on Annabel. "So, you're the new nanny," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Annabel kept her composure, offering a polite nod. "Yes, Mrs. Winthrop. Can I help you with something?" Helena's eyes glinted. "I wonder what Charles was thinking, hiring someone like you. The Harrington name requires discretion." The implication was clear, and it stung. Annabel's cheeks flushed, but she refused to rise to the bait. Later, as Henry napped, Annabel sat by the window, Helena's words replaying in her mind. Doubts crept back in, wrapping around her confidence like a vice. Was she truly out of place here? Would her presence ruin Charles's reputation? The door creaked, and she turned to see Charles standing there, his expression stormy. "Helena was here," he said, his voice tight. "She had no right to speak to you that way." Annabel looked away. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I don't belong in your world." Charles crossed the room, lifting her chin until their eyes met. "Don't let her poison what we have. I don't care about society's opinions. I care about you." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair. But Annabel knew this battle was far from over. The whispers of the past would not be silenced so easily. Charles's reassurance gave Annabel a flicker of hope, but the weight of Helena's words remained. In the days that followed, Annabel found herself glancing over her shoulder, second-guessing every step she took in the Harrington household. The once warm walls of the mansion now seemed colder, judgmental eyes watching her from unseen corners. Henry, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued to thrive under her care. His laughter was still a melody that filled the air, but Annabel's smile grew strained. Charles noticed her withdrawal. He tried to draw her out with quiet dinners and meaningful conversations, but a shadow had fallen between them. One evening, after Henry had gone to bed, Charles found Annabel standing by the window in the drawing room, the moonlight casting a glow on her contemplative face. He approached silently, his presence gentle but firm. "You've been distant," he said softly. Annabel didn't turn around. "I'm trying to protect myself, Charles. And protect you." He stepped closer, his voice low. "We're in this together. I won't let society dictate our happiness." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening. "But what if it's too much? What if this ruins everything you've worked for?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. The only thing that would ruin me is losing you. The words hung between them, a promise fighting to be heard. Charles's declaration lingered in Annabel's heart, but it wasn't enough to chase away her fears. That night, she lay awake, the walls of her room closing in. She thought about her past, the long line of disappointments and heartbreaks. Falling for Charles was a risk she hadn't planned to take, yet here she was, teetering on the edge of something vast and terrifying. The next morning, she carried those thoughts with her as she prepared Henry for the day. He looked up at her with innocent eyes and whispered, "Annabel, you look sad again." She knelt down, forcing a smile. "I'm just thinking a lot, my love." Henry frowned, his small hands cupping her cheeks. "Don't think too much. Just be happy." His words struck her with their simplicity and truth. But as the morning stretched on, the storm within her mind grew louder. Charles left for another business meeting, his parting kiss on her cheek gentle yet heavy with meaning. As she watched him drive away, Annabel felt a surge of frustration. How could love feel so right yet so wrong? The weight of societal judgment, of expectations, loomed too large to ignore. She paced the hallway, her heart a battlefield. Could she truly face the storm that lay ahead, or was it safer to step away before it consumed her entirely? The answer remained just out of reach. The whispers began to spread like wildfire. Helena Winthrop's sharp tongue had ignited the flames, and soon, the gossip of Charles's involvement with the nanny circulated through their social circles. Annabel heard snippets of conversation from the house staff, furtive glances and half-hidden smirks. It felt as though the walls of the Harrington estate were closing in on her. She could ignore the servants, but the weight of disapproval from Charles's peers felt unbearable. The fear that she was ruining his reputation clawed at her. Despite Charles's reassurances, doubt gnawed at her resolve. That afternoon, while Henry napped, Annabel took a walk through the garden. The roses, once symbols of beauty and growth, now felt like thorns in her side. She leaned against the stone fountain, tears slipping down her cheeks. A sudden voice broke her solitude. Thinking of leaving, Charles stood a few feet away, his face shadowed with concern. Annabel's breath hitched. Maybe it would be easier for everyone. His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with frustration. Easier for whom? For Helena. For people who know nothing about us. He stepped forward, his voice softening. Don't let them win, Annabel. Don't let them take this away from us. She wanted to believe him, but the shadows of doubt still lingered, clawing at the edges of her heart. Henry's birthday was approaching, and the mansion buzzed with preparations. Balloons, decorations, and the smell of freshly baked cakes filled the air. Annabel threw herself into the planning, hoping the distraction would ease the turmoil in her heart. She smiled for Henry, but behind closed doors, the weight of her decision loomed. Should she stay and fight for this fragile happiness, or leave before it crumbled? Her thoughts were interrupted when Henry ran up to her, his eyes bright with excitement. Annabel, look what I made. He held out a drawing, a picture of 3 figures holding hands, him, Annabel, and Charles. Above it, he had written in wobbly letters, "My family." The simplicity of the drawing pierced her heart. She knelt beside Henry, tears pooling in her eyes. "You're so special to me, Henry." He smiled, his arms wrapping around her neck. "You're special to me, too. And Daddy loves you. I know he does." Annabel's breath caught. "What makes you say that?" Henry shrugged, his innocence profound. "I see it in his eyes when he looks at you. Like how he looks at me when he's proud." Annabel hugged him tightly, his words a balm and a wound all at once. How could she walk away from this? But how could she stay, knowing the world might tear them apart? The day of Henry's birthday dawned bright and clear, as if the world itself had decided to celebrate. Children's laughter echoed through the gardens as guests arrived, their smiles genuine, their hearts untouched by the undercurrents swirling beneath the surface. Annabel watched Henry race around with his friends, his joy alight in her darkness. Charles stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Thank you for this," he said softly. "You've given him so much." Annabel smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He deserves it." Charles studied her, sensing the sadness she tried to hide. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Henry fell asleep, his face still flushed with excitement. Annabel carried him to his room, tucking him in with a kiss. When she turned, she found Charles waiting in the doorway. "Stay," he whispered, his voice raw. "Don't leave us." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough, Charles." He stepped forward, taking her hands. "You are. You've already proven it." His eyes searched hers, filled with hope and fear. "I love you, Annabel. Don't let the world's judgment steal what we have." His confession hung in the air, fragile and precious. Annabel's heart pounded. Could she risk it all for love? Annabel's heart was a storm of emotions after Charles's confession. Love, fear, hope, and doubt all tangled together, pulling her in opposite directions. She wanted to believe in his love, to trust that they could weather the storm together. But the whispers and judgment weighed heavily on her mind. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her decision loomed before her, impossible and overwhelming. In the early hours of the morning, she rose quietly, packing a small bag. She needed space, time to think without the mansion's walls closing in on her. She left a note on the kitchen table, her hands trembling. Charles woke to an emptiness that felt like a punch to the gut. He found her note, the words simple but devastating: "I need time. Please understand." Panic clawed at his chest. He searched the house, hoping she was still there, but the truth was undeniable. Annabel was gone. He sank into a chair, his heart heavy with despair. Had he pushed her too far? Was his love a burden she couldn't bear? Henry woke soon after, rubbing his eyes. "Where's Annabel?" he asked sleepily. Charles's throat tightened. "She's gone for a little while." The boy's face crumpled. "Did I do something wrong?" Charles gathered him into his arms, his voice breaking. "No, my boy. This isn't your fault." But deep inside, he feared it was his own. The days without Annabel felt like a slow descent into darkness. The Harrington estate, once filled with warmth and promise, was now suffused with emptiness. Henry felt the absence most acutely, his usual laughter replaced by a quiet, subdued demeanor. He clung to Charles more often, asking about Annabel with a trembling voice. Charles tried to hold everything together for Henry's sake, but inside, he felt shattered. His study became his refuge, where he buried himself in work, hoping it would numb the ache. Yet, every corner of the house whispered her name, the scent of lavender in the hallways, the faint echoes of her voice in Henry's room. Even the staff noticed the change. Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper, approached Charles one morning, her eyes filled with gentle concern. "Sir, forgive me for speaking out of turn, but the boy misses her. And so do you." Charles rubbed his temples, his voice low. "I know. But she needed time. I have to respect that." Mrs. Thompson nodded but added softly, "Sometimes time can heal. Other times, it can drive people further apart." Her words unsettled him, planting seeds of fear he couldn't shake. How long would Annabel need? Would she ever come back, or had his love driven her away forever? He couldn't escape the gnawing dread that his chance at happiness was slipping through his fingers. Annabel spent her days in a small cottage by the sea, a place she had discovered years ago during a rare moment of respite. The ocean waves were a soothing balm, their rhythmic crash offering a kind of peace she hadn't known she needed. Yet, despite the tranquil setting, her mind was in turmoil. She thought of Henry's innocent smile, of Charles's pained eyes, and the way their love had blossomed despite the odds. Had she made a mistake by leaving? Or was she protecting them from a future filled with judgment and heartache? Each question was a stone pressing down on her heart. In the evenings, she wandered the shoreline, her feet sinking into the cool sand. One night, as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, she saw a family playing in the distance, a mother, father, and a little boy. The scene sent a jolt of pain through her chest. Was she giving up on her chance for this kind of happiness? Her thoughts drifted to Henry. She missed his giggles, his stories, and the way he hugged her with unfiltered love. And Charles, she missed his steady presence, his words of reassurance, and the quiet strength in his eyes. The loneliness was a bitter pill. She realized then that running away hadn't brought clarity, only emptiness. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows of the cottage, Annabel sat at her small wooden desk and began writing a letter to Charles. The words poured out of her, each sentence a reflection of the love and fear warring in her heart. Charles, I left because I was afraid. Afraid of the whispers, of what the world would say. But being away from you and Henry feels like a part of me has been torn away. I miss Henry's smile. I miss your voice. I miss us. But I still wonder if my presence is more burden than blessing. I don't know if love is enough to fight against everything we're up against. Her hand trembled as she wrote the final words, I love you. I always will. She stared at the letter for a long time, tears blurring the ink. Folding it carefully, she placed it in an envelope and addressed it to Charles. But when she reached the door, ready to walk to the postbox, she hesitated. The fear returned, gripping her tightly. What if sending the letter shattered whatever fragile hope remained? Her indecision felt suffocating. Finally, she placed the letter in a drawer and shut it firmly. Maybe tomorrow she would find the courage to send it. But for now, the letter lay hidden, a silent testament to a love that refused to be extinguished. While Annabel wrestled with her uncertainty, back at the Harrington estate, Charles was a man on the edge of despair. He spent more and more time in his study, the walls closing and his loneliness took hold. But one evening, as he sat staring at the flickering fireplace, Henry entered the room, clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper. Daddy, I wrote Annabel a letter. Can you send it to her? Charles took the paper, his throat tight. The childish scrawl read, I miss you. Please come home. Love, Henry. A tear slid down Charles's cheek. If Henry could express his love so simply, why couldn't he? He rose with sudden determination. We're going to find her, Henry. The boy's eyes lit up with hope. They packed a small bag, and Charles gave instructions to Mrs. Thompson to manage the house in their absence. The journey to the seaside cottage was long, the air thick with anticipation. As they arrived, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the waves. Charles's heart pounded as he knocked on the door, Henry clutching his hand tightly. When Annabel opened it, her eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears. Henry ran into her arms, and she held him tightly, her heart shattering and healing all at once. Charles stepped forward, his voice raw. We're here because home isn't the same without you. The spark of hope flared into a steady flame. Maybe, just maybe, love was enough after all. Annabel held Henry close, tears soaking into his hair as she inhaled the scent of the little boy she had missed so desperately. She looked up to find Charles standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of relief and apprehension. His eyes searched hers for answers, for permission to hope. The world around them seemed to vanish as they stood in that fragile, precious moment. Finally, Charles stepped forward and whispered, "We missed you so much." Annabel's heart clenched at the sincerity in his voice. She wiped her tears and looked down at Henry, who clung to her like a lifeline. "I missed you too, my love," she whispered. Henry's smile bloomed, a ray of light breaking through the darkness. Charles closed the door behind him and took a cautious step toward her. "Annabel, we can't pretend that everything is fixed. But I need you to know, I'll fight for us. No matter what the world says, you belong with us." Annabel's eyes filled with tears again. "I was so afraid, Charles. Afraid of ruining everything for you and Henry." He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. "You haven't ruined anything. You've given us hope, joy, and love. That's worth more than what anyone else thinks." Her heart fluttered with the possibility of forgiveness, of a new beginning. The walls she had built around her heart began to crumble, letting love flow back in. That evening, they sat together by the fireplace in the small cottage. Henry fell asleep in Annabel's lap, his face peaceful and content for the first time in weeks. Charles watched them, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. "We can't go back to how things were," Annabel said softly, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "But maybe we can build something new." Charles nodded. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it together." The weight of the past few weeks began to lift, though scars remained. They spoke quietly, cautiously addressing the fears that had driven Annabel away. Charles confessed his own doubts, his guilt over not protecting her from the harsh judgments of society. Annabel listened, her heart aching with love for this man who had always carried so much responsibility on his shoulders. "I don't want you to fight this battle alone," she said, her voice steady. "If we're going to do this, we have to stand together." Charles's eyes glimmered with hope. "That's all I've ever wanted." They sat in silence, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. In the stillness of that night, the first fragile threads of trust and hope wove themselves back into their hearts. The next morning, the three of them stood outside the cottage, the salty sea breeze ruffling their hair. Annabel looked back one last time at the place that had sheltered her confusion and fear. It had been a sanctuary, but now she was ready to leave it behind. Charles took her hand, the warmth of his palm a silent reassurance. Henry skipped ahead, his joy infectious. "We're going home," he called out, his voice filled with excitement. Annabel smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The journey back to the Harrington estate was quiet, filled with moments of reflection and shared glances that spoke volumes. When they finally arrived, Mrs. Thompson greeted them at the door with a relieved smile. "Welcome home, Miss Annabel," she said softly, her eyes shining with warmth. Annabel's heart swelled. The word home no longer felt foreign or unattainable. Henry raced inside, his laughter filling the once empty halls. As Annabel stepped into the grand foyer, she took a deep breath. This house, which had once felt like a gilded cage, now felt like a place where love might grow and thrive. Charles squeezed her hand. "We'll take it one day at a time," he promised. And for the first time, Annabel believed that they could. Life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Annabel and Charles worked to rebuild the foundation of trust and love between them. Yet, the shadows of society's judgment still loomed. It wasn't long before Helena Winthrop made another appearance, her icy gaze fixed on Annabel. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, her disapproval radiating like a cold wind. "Charles, I need to speak with you," she said, her tone clipped. Annabel started to leave the room, but Charles held her hand firmly. Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Annabel. Helena's eyes narrowed. This is about appearances, Charles. You're risking everything by keeping her here. Annabel's heart clenched, but she stood her ground. Charles's voice was steel. The only thing I'm risking is my happiness if I let people like you dictate my life. Annabel belongs here. Helena's face contorted with frustration, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. You're making a mistake, she hissed before storming out. The silence that followed was heavy. Annabel's fingers trembled slightly in Charles's grasp. Are you sure about this? She whispered. He looked into her eyes, unwavering. I've never been more certain. For the first time, Annabel felt the strength of his commitment anchoring her fears. Helena's departure was like the striking of a match. Within days, rumors spread through their social circles like wildfire. The whispers turned cruel, insinuations about Annabel's past and her intentions. Annabel felt the sting of every unspoken word, every disapproving glance. She avoided going into town, her confidence fraying at the edges. One afternoon, as she helped Henry with a puzzle, a tear slipped down her cheek. Henry looked up, his brow furrowed. Annabel, are you sad again? She tried to smile, brushing the tear away. Just a little tired, sweetheart. But Henry wasn't convinced. He hugged her tightly, his small arms fierce with love. Later that night, Charles found Annabel sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. The gossip is getting worse, she murmured. I don't know how much more of it I can take. Charles knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. I know it's hard, but their words only have power if we let them. You are more than their judgment. We are more than that. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his worry. If it becomes too much, we can leave this place, start fresh somewhere else. Annabel's heart twisted. I don't want you to have to give up everything. He smiled softly. You and Henry are everything to me. His words wrapped around her like a shield, protecting her from the world's poison. The days blurred together, the strain of public scrutiny weighing on Annabel. But hope came from an unexpected place. One morning, as she walked through the garden, she encountered Margaret Whitmore, a respected member of the community known for her fierce independence. Margaret was standing by the roses, her eyes thoughtful. Beautiful, aren't they? She said. Annabel nodded, wary. Yes, they are. Margaret turned, her gaze sharp but kind. I've heard the whispers, Annabel. And I wanted to say, don't let them win. Annabel blinked in surprise. You don't think I'm ruining things. Margaret chuckled. My dear, love is rare. Anyone who finds it should cling to it, no matter what others say. Margaret's words were a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, Annabel felt a flicker of hope. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling. Strength comes in many forms, Annabel. Yours lies in your heart. Don't be afraid to use it. As she walked away, Annabel stood straighter, the weight on her shoulders just a little lighter. When she told Charles about the encounter, his eyes shone with gratitude. We're not alone in this, he said. And together, we're stronger than their judgment. Annabel nodded, a smile blooming on her face. Maybe, just maybe, they could withstand the storm. As days passed, Annabel found herself holding onto Margaret Whitmore's words. They replayed in her mind like a mantra, urging her to stand tall in the face of judgment. But resilience wasn't easy, especially when whispers grew louder. One afternoon, while strolling through the marketplace with Henry, Annabel felt the weight of 100 eyes on her back. Mutters and sidelong glances made her heart pound with anxiety. Henry, oblivious to the tension, pointed out a toy shop, his face alight with excitement. "Annabel, can we look?" he asked. Her first instinct was to retreat, to hide from the judging world, but she took a deep breath and smiled. "Of course, Henry." They entered the shop, the bell above the door tinkling softly. Inside, the air was warm and inviting. Henry dashed to a shelf of wooden trains, his eyes gleaming. Annabel felt a sense of normalcy return. But as she helped him choose a toy, she caught sight of two women whispering in the corner. "Ignore them," she told herself. Suddenly, one of the women spoke louder, just enough for Annabel to hear. "Disgraceful. She has no shame." Annabel's face burned, her resolve wavering. Henry tugged her hand, unaware of the cruel words. "Look, Annabel." His joy pulled her back. She knelt down, meeting his eyes. "That's a wonderful choice," she said softly. She realized then that this was what mattered, the love and joy between them. Later that evening, Charles noticed the shadow in Annabel's eyes as they sat by the fire. He reached over, his hand warm and steady on hers. "Rough day?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "I can handle the whispers, but when they look at Henry like he's part of the scandal." Her voice broke, and she turned away, blinking back tears. Charles moved closer, his fingers brushing her cheek, guiding her gaze back to his. "Annabel, listen to me. What we have, what we've built, it's worth more than their opinions. They don't know us. They don't know our love." His voice was firm, filled with conviction. Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe in the strength of their love. "What if they never accept us?" she whispered. Charles smiled softly. "Then we'll create our own world, our own family. Acceptance begins with us. I love you, Annabel. Nothing they say will ever change that." Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they were tears of relief. "I love you too, Charles," she whispered. He leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that spoke of all the promises they had yet to fulfill. In that moment, the noise of the outside world faded away, leaving only the pure, steadfast beat of their hearts. The days that followed felt different. Annabel walked through the estate with renewed purpose. Her conversations with Charles had breathed new life into her spirit. She spent her mornings with Henry, reading stories, tending the garden, and finding joy in small, quiet moments. The staff noticed the change, their smiles more genuine, their respect for Annabel growing with each passing day. Mrs. Thompson, who had always been a quiet supporter, brought Annabel a cup of tea one morning and said, "You belong here, Miss Annabel. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words warmed Annabel's heart, reinforcing the fragile confidence she was rebuilding. Charles, too, was making changes. He no longer attended the high society gatherings where Annabel was unwelcome. Instead, he spent his time with his family, reinforcing what truly mattered to him. One sunny afternoon, they had a picnic on the estate grounds. Henry ran through the meadow, his laughter ringing out like music. Charles and Annabel sat on a blanket, their fingers intertwined. "This is what happiness feels like," Charles said, his eyes soft as they watched Henry play. Annabel leaned her head against his shoulder. "Yes, it is." The simplicity of that day felt like a quiet triumph, a reminder that their love was strong enough to build a future worth fighting for. As summer waned into autumn, the winds of change whispered through the Harrington estate. The scandal that had once seemed insurmountable began to fade into the background. People's attention turned to new gossip, their judgmental eyes finally looking elsewhere. Annabel still encountered the occasional cold glance, but she met them with calm defiance. Her love for Charles and Henry anchored her in a way she had never known before. One evening, as the sun cast golden light through the trees, Charles surprised Annabel with a question that left her breathless. "Annabel, will you marry me?" She stared at him, heart pounding, joy and disbelief warring in her mind. "Charles, are you sure?" He smiled, his eyes warm and unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything. You are my future, Annabel. You, me, and Henry." Tears shimmered in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." He slipped a simple, elegant ring onto her finger, sealing the promise they had made to each other. Henry, who had been watching from a few steps away, ran to them, his face alight with joy. "Does this mean we're a real family now?" he asked. Charles scooped him up, his voice thick with emotion. "We've always been a real family, Henry. Now, the whole world will know it too." The air was filled with excitement as the days leading up to the wedding drew near. Annabel and Charles spent hours discussing every detail, from the flowers to the guests, to the vows they would exchange. It was the first time in months that Annabel felt the weight of the world lift. She no longer had to hide, she could love Charles openly, without fear. Henry, ever the curious child, insisted on helping with the arrangements. "I want to pick the cake," he declared one afternoon, his small face full of determination. Annabel smiled at his enthusiasm, her heart swelling with gratitude for this little family they were creating. Every decision they made brought them closer, reinforcing their bond. Annabel found herself often looking at Charles, as if seeing him for the first time. The love in his eyes was unwavering, and it filled her with an overwhelming sense of peace. As they worked together to plan their wedding, they found joy in the small moments, Henry helping to choose flowers, Charles suggesting a favorite song for their first dance. The simple act of creating something together felt like a victory over the challenges they had faced. Their love was becoming a testament to the resilience of the heart. Just as the preparations were in full swing, Helena Winthrop made her presence known once more. She arrived uninvited one afternoon, her demeanor as cold and imposing as ever. Annabel, who had been nervously preparing the house for the wedding, felt a shiver of dread as the doorbell rang. Mrs. Thompson, who had always been a steadfast supporter, opened the door to reveal Helena standing on the doorstep, her arms crossed. "Charles," Helena began, her voice clipped, "we need to talk. This wedding, it's a mistake." Annabel braced herself, but to her surprise, Charles remained calm, his voice even. "Helena, I've made my decision. Annabel and I are getting married. Nothing you say will change that." Helena's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight smile. "You're throwing your life away. I warned you, Charles. You've chosen a woman of questionable reputation. The people will never accept her as your wife." Her words stung, but Annabel stood firm beside Charles, not allowing Helena's venom to break her resolve. As Helena's disapproval echoed in the house, Annabel and Charles leaned on each other more than ever. Charles, although steadfast in his decision, struggled with the weight of his family's expectations. He spent long hours in his study, reflecting on the years of pressure he had faced from people like Helena. Annabel, understanding the burden he carried, would sit with him quietly, offering a silent solidarity. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Charles turned to her, his voice filled with vulnerability. "I've always lived my life for others. But I can't do that anymore. I have to live for us. For Henry, for you." Annabel's heart swelled as she reached for his hand. "And I'll always be here, Charles. To stand beside you. We've already faced the hardest part. Now we get to build something real." The love in her eyes was a balm for his weary soul. Together, they had already fought the world's judgment and emerged victorious. The final battle was won, not by avoiding conflict, but by embracing it and showing the world the strength of their love. Henry, who had been quietly listening, looked up from his plate and smiled. "You're my family," he said simply, and that was all that mattered. The morning of the wedding arrived, bathed in golden sunlight. Annabel stood before the mirror in her bridal gown, her heart racing with anticipation. As she glanced at herself, she felt a surge of confidence. The woman staring back at her was no longer the unsure Nanny who had been afraid of love. She was a woman who had fought for happiness, a woman who had found it, and now, she was ready to claim it fully. Henry, dressed in a small suit, burst into the room, his face lighting up. "Annabel, you look like a princess." Annabel laughed, her heart swelling with love for the little boy who had come to mean so much to her. She knelt down, hugging him tightly. "Thank you, sweet boy." Just then, Charles entered, his eyes filled with emotion as he saw Annabel for the first time that day. His gaze softened, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Annabel smiled, her voice barely audible. "I'm ready, Charles. Let's do this." And with that, they walked hand in hand toward the future they had built together. The ceremony was held in the grand garden of the Harrington estate, surrounded by blooming flowers and the soft rustle of leaves. The guests, some wary and others supportive, gathered to witness the union of Annabel and Charles. As the music played and Annabel walked down the aisle, her heart pounded, not with fear, but with joy. Charles stood at the altar, his eyes never leaving hers. The world seemed to pause as they exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever life would throw their way. Henry, standing between them, beamed with happiness. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Annabel felt that she truly belonged. The whispers faded into the background, overshadowed by the love that radiated from the newlywed couple. In that moment, nothing else mattered. They had faced the storms together, and now they stood stronger than ever, united not only by love but by the commitment to face every challenge as a family. The world could judge them, but they had something that would never be taken away: each other. The days following the wedding were filled with laughter and joy. Annabel and Charles enjoyed their honeymoon, a peaceful retreat to a quiet countryside estate. It was the first time in months that they had been able to truly relax without the weight of societal judgment on their shoulders. Henry thrived in the new dynamic, delighting in the love and attention of both of his parents. They spent long days exploring the countryside, and in the evenings, they would gather around a fire, sharing stories and dreams for the future. As they returned home to the Harrington estate, the house no longer felt like a place of pressure. It had become a sanctuary, a place where love flourished. Annabel knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with Charles by her side and Henry's joyful laughter filling the halls, she felt a sense of peace that she had never known. For the first time, she saw the future not as a series of obstacles, but as an open field full of possibilities. Together, they would face whatever came their way, secure in the love that had brought them through it all. As the seasons changed, so did the Harrington family. Annabel and Charles had been married for over a year now, and the love between them had only deepened. Henry, ever the energetic boy, had grown taller, his mischievous smile still as bright as ever. One afternoon, Annabel found herself sitting with Charles in their study, their heads bent over a new set of plans for the estate. Annabel's heart swelled as she looked around. The house, which had once felt like a gilded cage, now felt like home in every sense of the word. She had become a mother in her own right, not just to Henry, but to the future they were building together. Annabel had always dreamed of having children, and now, With Charles, she knew that dream would come true. The thought of expanding their family filled her with warmth. Charles, noticing the contented smile on her face, raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking, my love?" he asked with a knowing smile. Annabel laughed softly. "I think I'm ready for the next chapter. A family full of laughter, and maybe more little ones to love." As the months went by, Annabel's life seemed to settle into a rhythm of happiness and fulfillment. She found herself more involved in the local community, hosting charity events and supporting causes close to her heart. Charles continued to work hard to secure the future of the estate, but he always made time for Annabel and Henry. Their home became a gathering place for friends, family, and even the occasional neighbor who had once turned their back on them. The couple had built a reputation for being strong, loving, and unapologetic about their choices. One afternoon, Charles took Annabel aside as they walked through the garden. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful. "We've been through so much, and I don't want to waste any more time. Let's focus on the things that truly matter, the people we love, the future we're building, and the happiness we deserve." Annabel's heart swelled as she took his hand. "I couldn't agree more." They stopped beneath the old oak tree, the same spot where they had once shared their deepest fears. Now, it was a symbol of their strength and resilience. Months passed, and Annabel's dream of a larger family began to take shape. One afternoon, as she and Charles were enjoying a quiet moment by the fire, Annabel's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Charles," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up, his curiosity piqued. "What is it, my love?" Annabel's heart raced as she took his hands. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Charles's face broke into an enormous grin. "Are you serious?" he gasped, pulling her into his arms. Annabel nodded, her eyes brimming with joy. The news was met with celebrations from their close friends and family. Henry, now 6 years old, was overjoyed at the thought of becoming a big brother. "I'm going to teach them everything," he declared proudly, much to the amusement of everyone around him. Annabel and Charles, overwhelmed with happiness, knew that their family had grown. Even more. It felt like the beginning of another beautiful chapter in their lives, one filled with the promise of a new life, a new adventure, and an expanding family that would forever be rooted in love and resilience. As the days passed, Annabel felt the weight of the world lift even further, knowing that their love had triumphed over everything they had once feared. They were building a future, together, as a family. The months that followed Annabel's announcement were filled with preparation and anticipation. The estate, once just a house, had transformed into a home in every sense of the word. Every corner of the house was filled with laughter, hope, and the excitement of what was to come. Annabel, glowing with pregnancy, continued her charitable work, but now she did so with the added joy of knowing her family would soon grow even more. Charles, ever supportive, was more present than ever. He made sure to be there for Annabel, helping her in any way he could, whether it was with a cup of tea in the mornings or accompanying her on walks through the grounds of their estate. Henry, his older brother to be pride evident, often helped Annabel with small tasks, excited to be a part of the preparations. He would speak to the baby growing inside Annabel's belly, often rubbing her stomach with a gentle hand and telling the baby stories about the adventures they would have together. On a crisp autumn evening, as Annabel and Charles sat together by the fire once again, surrounded by family and warmth, they shared a quiet moment of reflection. The struggles they had faced, public scorn, judgment, uncertainty, now seemed so distant, like a bad dream they had long since awakened from. "This is all I've ever wanted," Charles murmured, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of emotion that still made Annabel's heart race. A family. With you. Annabel, filled with gratitude and joy, leaned her head on his shoulder. And now, we have everything we need, she replied softly. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside, their love remained unshaken. Together, they had built a family, a future, and a life beyond anyone's expectations. And as the years passed, they knew that their story was one of hope, perseverance, and love, a love that could never be broken. Their family was just beginning, and the world was full of endless possibilities. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this amazing story? Please leave a like and subscribe for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.